Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 96, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. The autumn equinox is coming up, and here in Montana, we have yet to have our first frost. They're saying possibly Monday morning, so this weekend we're going to dig potatoes and get the garden cleaned up, bring in all the winter squash and the last of the tomatoes, and call it good. And I always like this weekend, when we put the garden to bed, because that means that sewing can begin full time. My sewing time tends to get cut down in the summer because there are lots of outdoor activities and gardening, and this summer I did manage to squeak out more time than usual, but I do have way more time to sew in the winter. This past week has been sort of humbling. If you listened to last week's episode about beginning machine embroidery, you were getting my perspective as someone who has not done any machine embroidery. And it was kind of a frustrating week. I say it was humbling because anytime you learn a new skill, you have to be willing to suck at it, at least for a while, and that's not a place that a lot of us are comfortable. Some of my frustration also stems from the fact that I was getting conflicting information. I don't know if you noticed, but I didn't talk much about needles, embroidery needles last week, and I'm beginning to think that that was probably a good thing, because that's an area where I am still trying to figure out what's going on. And obviously, embroidery needles are an obvious choice, but there are situations where a microtext needle works better than an embroidery needle. So I'm still finding my way through all of that. I did get some wise counsel from Marianne, the owner of the quilt store here where I teach, the Quilt Gallery, and that has helped tremendously. But do not look at me for being an expert on machine embroidery. I can just tell you what I have learned so far, and it's not much. I've also been puttering around, cleaning up my sewing area. Until yesterday, I haven't really wanted to start a new project because I couldn't decide what I wanted to start. The weather hasn't changed enough for me to think about winter sewing yet, so the most I've done is to put away some of my woven fabrics and to look at my bins of sweater knits and bottom weight fabrics and decide what I need in my wardrobe. Yesterday, though, I did cut out all of the pattern pieces for the Can Do retro sling bag, which has been on my list for a long time. I like the design of this bag, and I've been wanting to try one out. So I got out the pattern and started cutting the pattern pieces. I'm using some waxed canvas that I got from Sailrite, which is absolutely wonderful to work with. And I'm using bonded nylon from Wonderground Fabrics for the lining. It's a bit tricky to work with, but I'm getting used to it. And so far, I have put in a zipper, and I expect that this project will take me a few weeks. The store is gearing up for our big event next week, which is to welcome Kay Fassett and Brandon Mabley. On Monday, we are having a lecture at the local high school, and I'm going to help out with that and just do some grunt work to smooth things along. On Tuesday, I am in the Economy Block workshop. Wednesday is the Diamond Quilt workshop, which I'm not part of. I didn't sign up for that one. On Wednesday, also, I'm going to be helping to get our craft co-op sale set up. That happens on Friday and Saturday of next week. It's held at the church that I attend, the Mennonite church. So on Wednesday, because I've got a key to the church, I let people in and we start pulling out tables and getting things set up. And then on Thursday, everyone comes to put out merchandise and put up signs and make it look like just a wonderful place to buy handmade goods made in Montana. So, next week is a busy week and it's going to be full of a lot of sewing and making. This afternoon, after I finish recording this podcast, I'm going to pop into Kalispell because the Flathead Quilters Guild has their annual show this weekend at the fairgrounds, and I want to go see all of the beautiful work that's on display there and listen to some of the seminars. So that's what's been going on here and what's going to be happening in the next week or so. For today's episode, I have a great interview with Amy Pabst, who is a specialist in miniature and microquilting. And I didn't even know this was a thing until I ran across her profile on Instagram and saw some of what she was making, and my mind was blown. She does the most gorgeous, tiny pieced log cabin and pineapple quilts. And she graciously sat down for an interview with me. So we're going to talk about how she got started in that particular niche of quilting and where it has taken her. And I think that you will find it fascinating, even if you're not a quilter. I am joined this morning by Amy Pabst, who is a quilter, but she is a very special quilter. She specializes in micro piecing. So we're going to talk to Amy about her quilting journey and how she got into this specialized area. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Janet. It's so good to be here today.
I usually start by asking people how they learned to sew. Did someone teach you? How old were you?
So I was 10 years old, and my mother and my grandmother taught me to sew. And my grandmother worked in a clothing factory, like a sweater factory, where she was a pattern designer. And then my mom just sewed like everything for the home and sewed all of our clothes and everything like that for my sister and I. And so at that time, they both worked at a dry cleaners, and I did the clothing alterations for the dry cleaners, and that was how I really, really learned to use a sewing machine. And I did not enjoy the clothing alterations at all. I did not like hemming dresses. I did not like replacing zippers, but I made a good little amount of money off of that. But for a 10-year-old, the one thing that I got out of that was that I really, really learned how to use a sewing machine really well and had that skill just for the rest of my life.
Were your mother and your grandmother also quilters?
I think my grandmother made a few quilts. I know her mom, my great grandmother, was a very prolific quilter. But I think my mom, or no, my grandmother was more geared towards like clothing construction. And then my mom made a few quilts when she was a young woman, but they weren't like active, busy quilters. They were like interested in other aspects of sewing.
So who introduced you to quilting, or was that something that you picked up yourself?
Okay, so I stayed away from sewing for a long time because I just didn't enjoy the alterations. But then when I was in my early 20s, my parents bought me a new sewing machine for Christmas. And I was in the local library and I just kind of like randomly picked up this book about quilting. And I went home and started cutting up fabric that day and started making quilts that day. And I haven't stopped since then.
Do you still have the first quilt that you made?
Yes. So it was a giant, I had a really, really tiny little brother machine, and it was a giant queen size quilt. And I didn't know exactly what I was doing, but somehow, like, I sewed that quilt in like 9 different sections and then attached the sections. I don't remember exactly how I did it, but yes, I still have that quilt, and it's got like the purchase binding that you can get from Walmart. So it had like cheap binding on it, and the binding starting to come off. But yeah, I still have that quilt.
How on earth did you discover micro piecing?
When I had been quilting for maybe 5 or 6 years, 4 or 5 years, I started looking at the all magazines and saying, I want to be in these quilt competitions. I want to be in these magazines. So like I started thinking like what would be a good way to get into that, and I decided to make miniature quilts. So my first little foundation piece log cabin, it was 24 inches by 24 inches, and it had 3-inch blocks in it. and they were foundation piece. And foundation piecing was just something that I kind of taught myself. And I made that quilt, and it got a ribbon at the NQA show in Columbus that year. And that just like set me off making miniatures. So I kept making the log cabins. And then over the years, they just got smaller and smaller and smaller. So I went from 3-inch blocks, and then I've made quilts that have 1/2 inch blocks. So I like a challenge, and I'm a real perfectionist, and I'm kind of like in competition with myself. Just over the years, I just got smaller and smaller and smaller and just kept going and just like pursued it to like the end.
So maybe we should give some definitions or explanations about foundation paper piecing and
Yes,
how it
absolutely.
differs from
Yeah.
other types of quilting. So,
Foundation piecing is when you sew, you have a product like some people use muslin. I use a really lightweight interfacing. Some people use paper, and they have the paper will have the design of your block printed on it. And then you stitch your fabric pieces directly to the paper. And that gives you a really high level of accuracy because you're following the lines on the paper, and lets you really do just like precise piecing. I call what I do foundation piecing as opposed to paper piecing, because with me, paper piecing is where you pull the paper out after you're finished piecing. But with foundation piecing, your foundation material stays in the quilt and acts as a stabilizer. So that's kind of like the differentiation between paper piecing and foundation piecing.
I have great admiration for people who do foundation piecing because I have terrible spatial perception.
Oh no.
And I've never done it
Hmm.
precisely because I think I would have so much trouble with it. But you're sewing on the back side, aren't you? So the
Right.
foundation is
Yeah.
on the
So,
top and the fabric is on the bottom.
right. So when the your block is actually under the needle in the machine, the side that you're seeing is the foundation side or the paper side. So that's the side that you're stitching on, and then your fabric is kind of like tucked up underneath the foundation between the foundation and the feed dogs. Yeah,
Okay.
so it is kind of like you have to position your fabric and then flip it over and sew it from the back, and then flip it back to the front. So it is kind of it's a process, yeah.
It's probably one of the few sewing techniques or quilting techniques that I haven't tried yet.
Mhm. Well, the log cabin block is a great place to start for that because it's all straight lines.
I guess maybe for the non-quilters in the audience, a typical quilt block has 1/4 inch seams. But if you're doing these tiny, tiny squares or tiny, tiny
Mhm.
blocks,
Mhm.
how do you deal with that 1/4 inch seam?
So with foundation piecing, you trim your seam allowances as you're going along. And some people, if you're making like a bigger block, you would trim your seam allowances to 1/4 of an inch. But with the little blocks, like anything 3 inches or smaller, I trim my seam allowances to about 1/8 of an inch. And it's still like there's a lot of fabric from each piece. From each the seam allowance for each piece, there's a lot of fabric in the block. So like the smaller your blocks get, the more seam allowance is building up. So like the smaller blocks are stiffer than the larger blocks. So like by the time I do like a 1 inch block, it's really pretty stiff with all those layers of fabric in there. Yeah.
What's the smallest block you've done?
Okay, so the smallest block I've done was a pineapple block. It measured 1/2 inch, and then it had 27 pieces per block. So the finished pieces are just a hair over a millimeter. Like they were really, really tiny.
Oh my goodness.
That was like as small as it is physically possible to get. Like I don't think that you could manipulate fabric that was any smaller pieces than that. So that was a real challenge to do that for sure.
Thread obviously adds a little bit of bulk. So how do you deal with the thread issue?
Thread adds a lot of bulk, especially in the smaller your blocks get, the more you'll notice like the thickness of the thread, and it can mess up your accuracy just because there's like and on a 3 inch block it's not so bad. On a 5 or 6 inch block you wouldn't notice it at all, but the smaller you get, the more bulk there is, the more noticeable it is. And so I use monofilament thread. I like Monopoly by Superior Threads, and then Sulky has a pretty good monofilament thread, and it's just a really, really fine polyester thread, and it's so thin, it's like a human hair almost, and it it adds like just like a negligible amount of bulk. So I use that thread in the top and in the bobbin.
What kind of machine are you sewing on when you're doing this?
Okay, so I do all of my piecing on a 1947 Singer Featherweight. I love that machine. And those featherweights, it does, they do one thing, a straight stitch, and they do it really, really well. And the monofilament thread can be kind of tricky to use in some machines. It's just like a really tricky thread to work with. But the featherweight machine just takes it perfectly. So, yeah, I do all my piecing on that little old featherweight, and then I do my quilting. I have a pretty good size Bernina machine that I do my quilting on.
All of us who have featherweights are now wondering if we can do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I normally do my quilt piecing on a necky machine that's about the same vintage as your featherweight, but I do have a featherweight, so I think maybe I could
Yeah.
trade on that.
Yeah. So when I first got my featherweight, it had like it was in really good condition and it had those beautiful gold decals on it. So now like the decals are almost totally gone just from where I've used it. So I've used it a lot.
What kinds of fabrics do you use mostly quilt cottons or have you branched out into other fabrics?
I use just like all sorts of fabrics. The last couple quilts that I've done had velvets and some linen blends and some silk and wool blends and silk dupioni and loads of synthetics. I work with a lot of synthetics, and I think there was even a couple rayon blends. And there was one fabric in there that had spandex, so it was super stretchy. And because you're working with the foundation and the foundation gets left in as a stabilizer, you can use any sort of fabric that you want. It's like any sort of fabric. And actually, like piecing the smaller blocks, like the really small ones, you want to use a really thin, lightweight fabric. So, like if you tried to use Kona cotton or batik or something like that for a half-inch block or a 1 inch block, it's like affects your accuracy because like when you fold it, there's just so much thickness there. So, like for the very small blocks, I'll use like polyester lining fabric that's like intended to be used in clothing. And I use a lot of like upcycled silk sari material and kimono silk, and it's usually pretty thin and lightweight. So, yeah, the smaller you go, it helps just to have a thinner, lighter weight fabric. And like I said, because that foundation gets left in there, it's a stabilizer, so you can just use any fabric. Yeah.
Do you print your own foundation?
Yes, I do. So the product that I use for foundations is developed by George Siciliano, who is a miniaturist, and he developed this product called Foundation Stuff, and that's what I currently use. And you just run it through your inkjet printer, and I use EQ electric quilt to actually draft my blocks, and then yeah, I just print them on my own foundation.
Do you stick mostly to straight lines? You talk about log cabin blocks and pineapple blocks, which are basically straight units, but
Mhm.
have you done any curved piecing at all?
No, especially not with foundation piecing and something that's small. I don't know how I would manage it. I've done like curved piecing on really large sail quilts, but never on the miniatures. I don't know how that would even work. It would be
Okay.
pretty intense. Yeah.
You've written a book,
Yes.
and the title of it is,
The title is Log Cabin, the 100,000 Pieces Project. It was published in 2020, like during the first part of the pandemic. So
was it really 100,000 pieces?
yes. So I was making the log cabin blocks and they were doing good in competition, so I thought I'll just keep making them. And I kept track of all the numbers, like all the number of the blocks and the number of pieces in each block and like kept count of them. And my friends at the local guild would say, Amy, when are you going to try something else besides the log cabins? And I was like, when I get to 100,000 pieces total, then I'll consider the log cabin series finished. So yes, there really were 100,000 pieces of fabric.
Wow. How
Yeah.
long does it take?
I like to just make one quilt. So the log cabins that I worked on, um, for the first book, I worked on those like over a period of like 3.5 years. And I was doing other quilts at the time and also working part-time, so I didn't get to like dedicate as much sewing time as I wanted to. But the log cabins took about 3.5 years. And then my next major series with the pineapple quilts, that took 3 years to make 27 quilts. But that was during the pandemic, so I had a lot more free time.
What's the typical size of your quilt? Or what are we talking here?
hmm So, if it's got 3-inch blocks in it, then the size is usually about, oh, I don't know, maybe like 30, 28, 30 by maybe 40 inches. So, not like tiny, but not very big either. Although I did make a queen size quilt with the 3-inch blocks one time, and that was dreadful. That was a little too much. And then my micro piecing quilts, some of them are 24 by 38, but most of them are more like 12 or 14 inches or 10 inches on the short side. Yeah.
It sounds like you differentiate between miniature and micro.
Yes. Yes. So miniature piecing in the US is typically considered a block that is 4 inches or less and has a reduced scale of like the size of the pieces. Like you can't have a 9 patch that's 4 inches and really consider that like a miniature block. Like it has to be really reduced in scale. And so I consider miniature to be anything like less than 4 inches. But then with the micro piecing, I consider it micro piecing if the blocks are 2 inches or less, and if the finished pieces are 1/8 inch or less. So yeah, I do kind of like there's miniature and then there's micro. So I do really have like a distinguishing between the two.
I did a quilted jacket a few months ago and
Mhm.
it had flying geese units in it.
Okay.
And the smallest flying geese unit that I made was an inch high.
Yeah, that's pretty small.
And
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know that I could do more than that. But it really did make a difference. I think I used a 100 weight thread
hmm
to sew them together, and the difference between that and regular quilting thread, like I use in my necky when I'm piecing quilts, I typically use Aurifil. And
Yeah,
so there was a very big difference between those two, using those two different threads, and how much easier it was to make the tiny blocks. It still wasn't
absolutely. Yeah.
easy,
But
but
it makes a difference.
it does
Yeah.
make a difference, yes. So you have an exhibit coming up. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So the name of the exhibit is Micropiecing, and it is a series of 27 quilts. The official name for the exhibit is Micropiecing Quarter Million. So quarter million represents that in that collection of 27 quilts, there's 250,000 pieces of fabric.
Wow.
So that exhibit, as a collection, has been, it was in Road California, it was in Houston, it was in the Festival of Quilts in England last year, and then this year, oh, it was also in the Virginia Quilt Museum earlier this year. And then this fall, those 27 quilts are going to be at the Dairy Barn in Athens, Ohio. And I am really, really looking forward to that.
Do you teach at all?
Yes, I do. So I teach one workshop and it's either foundation piecing a log cabin or a pineapple. So technically two workshops, but they're essentially the same. And in these classes, we start out making a 3-inch block, and some of the women have never foundation pieced before. So we start out making a 3-inch block, and they get so excited about it. And then I pull out the 2-inch foundations, and about more than half, almost everyone in the class will do a 2-inch block, and everybody's so excited about that. And then I pull out the 1-inch foundation, and there's always at least like 4 or 5 people in the class who get to the 1-inch size block. And when they make those blocks, they're just like so amazed that it was possible and it wasn't like it's as difficult as they thought. So that's really nice getting to see that excitement of someone trying something that they didn't think they would be good at, but they were successful anyway. So that it's nice to see that.
We've covered a bit of territory here.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you have any plans for another book?
So I'm sort of thinking about because my book was published with Quilt Mania and they folded. Very sad. But so I'm kind of like looking at C&T Publishing. They have like where you can just like submit a proposal for a book. So I'm sort of thinking about that, but I'm in my last semester of undergrad right now, so like that's my first priority is to get this degree, and then I'm going to start looking at other things. And I would like to have a second book for sure.
What's your degree going to be in?
It is a fine arts degree, BFA in visual art with an emphasis in fibers. So my classes are like surface design and needle felting, did embroidery, and I just got out of I was in a weaving class this morning, and weaving is one of my favorite things. But yeah, so it's a fiber art degree.
I hope they gave you credit for your quilting.
Well, actually, like in all of my assignments, even like in my sculpture class, I always try to somehow make a quilt or something like quilt related. So even like in printmaking, I would be doing like printing quilt designs on paper. And in sculpture, I was like making three-dimensional quilting racks to hang quilts on. So yeah, I always find a way to like sort of like sneak it in there.
Have you exhausted everything with microquilting or
Oh,
micropiecing?
yeah, absolutely not. So the quilts, the miniatures and the micros do so good in competition that I'm kind of like I'm just gonna like keep carrying it and see how far I can go with it. So like my past three competition quilts were log cabins. And then the quilt that I'm working on for next year's competition shows, I just finished it not too long ago. And it's a pineapple, it's a 2-inch pineapple block. And the quilt measures 34 inches square and has 27,000 pieces of fabric in it.
Oh my gosh.
So, yeah. So, no, I don't think we'll ever exhaust it because I mean, like the layout possibilities are endless, the color schemes are endless. So, yeah, I don't feel like I've exhausted it. And I'm definitely not getting bored making those. So,
I'm just wondering when you said that you really liked weaving, if you're going to maybe venture into micro tapestry or something.
oh, I don't know about that. Weaving is tough. Weaving is a lot harder than I thought it would be.
It's good though, I think, to maybe branch out because doesn't that give you inspiration?
It really does. So, like, one of the most important things I've learned, like about weaving, for instance, is like it helped me understand like the anatomy of a piece of fabric, like why it stretches more in the width than the length, and why like if you fold a crease in the cross grain and fold a crease in the long grain, like it keeps a different type of crease, like it creases better parallel to the selvage. And so like weaving and getting to actually see like how the structure of fabric is made just really helped me understand a lot more about fabric. Yeah, like the anatomy of a piece of fabric.
Did you do any spinning at all? We're getting a little off far off field, but
Oh, yeah, I did a little bit of drop spinning. And I was like working with linen fibers and silk fibers. So I did a little bit of spinning, but I haven't ever done a wheel before.
where are you taking classes? Where's your degree going to be from?
So it is from Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia. And a few years ago, when I decided I wanted to complete my undergrad, I started looking around at like art history programs in West Virginia. And I kind of like stumbled across the fibers program at Marshall. And I was like, this is too good to pass up. It's practically in my backyard. So yeah, it's a local degree. So yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to cover, or have we hit everything?
Maybe if you want a fun fact about me, in the
Sure.
past 10 years, in the past 10 years, I have sewn together 400,000 pieces of fabric.
Oh my
So,
gosh.
yeah.
That's got to be some kind of record.
Actually, it's not. There's in the Guinness Book of World Records, there is a man who made this massive quilt, and it was made up with little quarter-inch hexagons. And I think in the single quilt, there was like 180,000 pieces, something like that. So he's got the record for it for that many pieces in like one single quilt.
Very cool. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to talk today.
Absolutely. I'm always glad to talk about quilts.
That was such a fun conversation with Amy. And I didn't ask her until after we had stopped recording, but she does have an Instagram account at Amy Makes Quilts. And I highly suggest that you go there and take a look at some of her work because it is truly amazing. So thank you again, Amy, for being on the podcast. We're coming up on the 100th episode in about another month. And thank you to everyone who has sent listener questions. I've got some really good ones. I've got a lot of ideas for future episodes out of some of those questions. And there's still time. If you want to send a listener question, you can send it to Janet at janetzabo.com. You can also leave feedback on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can use the fan mail feature. I do try to respond to all the emails. Sometimes it takes me a week or two. And I have to say, I got an email from someone whose name I think was Peter about making a quilt using fleece or minky. And I was reading the email and all of a sudden it disappeared. And I cannot find it again in my email program. So I have no idea what happened. Just who knows, gremlins, whatever. But if you're listening and you'd send me that email again, I will respond to you. I'm really sorry about that. Show notes can be found at the podcast website, which is www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. My website is www.janetzabo.com with links to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website and my blog where I have pictures of all sorts of stuff happening here in Montana. And this past week, I had lots of pictures of produce because we've been bringing in the harvest and wrapping up the garden, and it's now time for 24/7 sewing, or just as close as I can get to it. So I am off to my sewing room. I hope you have a great week and that you get to go sew something.